Number one, as we're emphasizing throughout the weekend, the rebirth of the state of Israel. Now, I've had people say to me, well, why is that so important? Because as Mark suggested to us, all of Bible prophecy about the end times assumes Israel will be back in the promised land in the last days. Well, they weren't there for nearly 1900 years. After the destruction of Jerusalem by the Roman army in 70 AD, and again in about 132 AD, the Jewish people were scattered all over the planet. If you were to pick up a map from the Middle Ages, Israel is not on the map. The Roman emperor changed the name of the nation to what? Palestine. Palestine is the Latin form, Palestina, of Philistines. I wrote my first academic book on Philistine archaeology. The Philistines were the enemies of Israel. It was about the worst name he could ever give the country. He did that deliberately. He originally changed the name of Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina, naming it after the Capitoline family of the Caesars. If you've been to Rome, you've toured the Capitoline Hill, the same name, the same term. He was trying to wipe out their memory. Now, the tragedy is that as the centuries followed, and there was no Israel on a map, there was no nation of Israel, then after a while, by the Middle Ages, Christians began to assume, well, God must be through with Israel. I don't see how they could ever go back and exist again as a nation back in the promised land. And then theologians began to come up with the idea that maybe the church was the new Israel and would receive the blessings that had been promised to Israel in the Old Testament. Well, all those blessings are very literal and very physical in nature. So then you have to say, well, they're not literal and they're not physical. They're simply spiritual in some way. And you change the whole concept of what the name Israel means, what the nature of the blessing is, and to whom the blessing should then be applied. Now, here's the problem. It's always dangerous to try to understand the future through the eyes of the present. If you were living in the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 10th century, the eyes of the present back then, it would look like there's never going to be an Israel again. It's not going to happen. But there were always those that held strictly to the biblical concept that no, one day Israel must return to the promised land. And that again, there would be a nation called Israel. There was actually a book written in 1946 by a Baptist pastor who argued Israel will never again be a nation. It's not going to happen. Well, it happened 2 years later. The prophet Isaiah foresaw this hundreds of years in advance. As he comes down to the end of his book, Isaiah chapter 66, verse 8, he says, "Who has heard of such a thing? Who has seen such things? Shall the earth be made to bring forth in one day? Shall a nation be born at once? But as soon as Zion travailed, she brought forth her children." Isaiah, by the inspiration of the Spirit of God, looks down through the tunnel of time, looks down through the halls of history into the distant future, some 2,700 years, and says one day Israel will become a nation in one day. It happened on May 14, 1948, when on that one day the Jewish people dared to declare their independence. And the intensity of Satan's hatred was unleashed against them immediately as they were attacked by nearly every one of their neighbors instantly and had to fight their war of independence, fight for their own survival. Some of you are old enough here tonight that you remember the 6-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, and all the other battles that have gone on over the years where the neighbors of Israel, time and time again, under extreme Islamic hatred, have attempted to annihilate her and drive her out of the land. And yet the prophet Amos said Israel would return a second time to the land, never to be driven out again. That God has promised to put down a stake at the time of the end. Now, if Bible prophecy assumes Israel will be back in the land in the last days, and Israel's there, that at least ought to get our attention. That the stage is being set for what God is preparing to do in the future. Now, critics will sometimes say, even among believers, well, Ed, they're there in unbelief. Yeah, there's a lot of church members in church in unbelief too. That doesn't mean that church is a bad thing. Israel, the prophet Ezekiel said, would go back in two stages. Physically and then spiritually. They have to be back in the land for that final work of God to be done in their hearts and lives, and they're there. Now, Messianic Jewish believers will tell you at the beginning of the 20th century, there was only a handful of born-again Messianic Jews. Today, there are somewhere between 20 and 30,000. There are over 100 Messianic congregations in Israel. I've had the privilege of preaching in those congregations. I'll be there again in June, preaching in the Jerusalem Assembly, one of the oldest Messianic congregations in Jerusalem. It's very convicting for a Gentile Christian to stand in Jerusalem and preach to Jews that believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Savior. Very convicting and yet very thrilling at the same time.